You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today I want to talk about a topic that often comes up. I get a lot of questions about it, and I have two experts on the subject, and that is, does burning in your pines in the late summer or fall affect their survival and growth? So I appreciate you guys coming on. I have Morgan Varner and John Willis here with me, and if you guys are ready to go, I would love to start out sort of in general. I know, Morgan, this is right in your wheelhouse. What are the factors that we should be thinking about, or the factors, I guess, that are affecting pines? I know a lot of our listeners have pine plantations or an interest in pine forests. So I'm just curious, from your background with tree mortality, what are the things that are causing trees to die?
Yeah, well, tree mortality is a response from some injury to the crown, to the stem or the bole, and to the roots. And the way that fire primarily, given our topic today, affects those is pretty diverse because, as anybody who's burned very much knows, fire is really diverse in the way it functions and interacts with individual trees and with stands. The most apparent of the injuries post-fire typically is damage to the crown, and that's the way people look at crown scorch. And it's really obvious in southern pines, but it's also pretty fleeting. They will start browning really the day or day after burning takes place, and so all of us have had this experience where we burn and go, "Oh, this looks really nice," and then you'll start to see what a friend of mine calls the olive drab. It's like a J. Crew color or something in the foliage. And over the next couple of days, it starts to go from that, lush green to a little bit of an orange, and then goes full orange. And for most of the southern pines, within the first 2 or 3 weeks, you'll have that. They'll fully express how much injury they sustained, and they're crowned by that browning or oranging, really, of the crown foliage. And there's a lot of stuff happening in the crown with fire. It's really responding to the radiation from the fire, but mostly the convection, that heat rising up through the crown. And so the injury tends to follow those convective pathways. So it has that browning, and then often you'll see, particularly if you're burning in plantations or in young stands, you'll see some foliage turn black and almost look like a suspended animation where it's just sticking out to the side in an awkward way. And that means that the leaves were either consumed by fire, and they'll be blackened to show their charring. And if you look at the leaves close enough, and pine needles are really good, their tips will be missing. And it means that those leaves sustained temperatures that were not just hot enough to kill them, but were hot enough to ignite them. Killing them usually is around 145, 150 degrees Fahrenheit, but igniting them is in the many hundreds of degrees. So it's a very different sort of injury. If you have that consumption or that charring on those leaves in the crown, it means that the branches sustained a lot of heat, and likely the bole and the stem sustained a lot of heat. The best way we have to look at the stem or the bole is usually just that bowl charring that's across all species, that blackening of the bowl. It's not very informative. Usually it tells you the direction the fire was going after the fire, and that's about it. You'll see the extremes. If it was really hot, you'll see it charred all the way up, and if it was pretty cool, you'll see pretty low char. And then the other way is in the roots, and that tends to be almost exclusively in long unburned stands. So it's been a decade or several decades since the last fire. They have that deep forest floor, and that forest floor will ignite, and that heat will conduct down into the surface soil and kill some roots. And what tends to happen with fire is almost all three of those occur simultaneously. And so it's a pretty hard topic. I'm glad we have 3 hours to talk about it today.
3 hours, huh? You want me to let you continue on for 3 hours? I mean, just in the time you gave me right there, I've already ordered 2 J. Crew t-shirts, and would you say olive drab and burnt orange?
Burnt orange. I was going to say the other part of that, of all of this is that fire is so diverse in the way that it moves through stands, whether it's you're backing a little fire through a pine plantation or it's a head fire that's skipping all over the place. As good as our models are for predicting mortality, there's a lot of slop in them because fire is so diverse. And so depending on how you're igniting it, depending on, what the conditions of the day were, all those factors really go into this, what ends up being a pretty messy story, unfortunately, because it'd be nice to have a silver bullet and say, do X and you get Y. But with tree mortality and fire, it's a pretty difficult story.
When you're talking about potential ways that fire kill trees, a lot of those ways, it sounds like, are not actually by fire getting into the canopy. We're not talking about a crown fire where the fire is actually burning the canopy. It's really, a lot of it is from the heat from the understory burning, or understory and midstory in some cases. And then with the long unburned affecting the roots, is that because the fuel is accumulating around the base of the tree, or what is going on with that?
Yep, that's exactly what's happening. That what tends to happen without fire is you get obviously get an accumulation of fuel, but around particularly large pines, old pines, you'll get these mounds that look like sort of the front yard in all of our childhoods. In the South, you see that big mound of what in our childhoods was a bunch of litter that you were as a kid raking around the pines. But in the woods, what that really is a bunch of bark slough. It's about 2/3 or 3/4 of that mound at the base of the tree is bark slough. And bark sloughs off, it accumulates, it doesn't decompose very rapidly. So you get a mound and it sheds water really well. And so when you do have precipitation, that stuff will shed water. And so those mounds tend to be really dry. Pine roots will grow into them if you've ever dug around those or tried to rake around one of those. And what tends to happen is they'll ignite from really, pretty innocuous fires, and they'll start to smolder. And that smoldering will take place over hours or sometimes days, and it'll just continue to send that heat and that conductive pulse through the mineral soil. And all those roots that are growing near the surface, like they've been trained to do for millennia, are really in peril. And what we found is a lot of fine roots die, which is a little bit of a big deal, but also a lot of coarse roots will die. And you'll see in those, they have a lot of storage carbohydrates they use to defend, they use to build new roots and new leaves. And you'll see a really steep decline in all those whenever you have smoldering fires.
Okay. So are there actually more roots? Are the roots in a layer that's flammable now when that accumulation is happening, or is that just from holding that heat there?
It's both. Yeah, what we found is longleaf in particular, but all the southern pines or at least the upland southern pines are pretty well adapted to fire. And what we think anyway is that fire has been so continuous in their past that they don't know any better. When you have a long fire excluded period, they're growing to where they can get organic material, where they can get nutrients, where they can get water. And so they'll put their roots up into those. And in general, we found about the same amount of root biomass in those duff mounds as we do in the mineral soil beneath. So burning the duff mound kills about half the roots, and then the conduction through the mineral soil will tend to take out a lot more.
I got you. So it's sort of this combined effect. The naive trees, so to speak,
Yeah,
they've gone a
they
long
are.
time without having to worry about it. So they start growing where the nutrients are, which sounds like is flammable material when it's
It
accumulating over
is.
time.
Well, Morgan, when you think about it, a tree's need for nutrients and moisture is continuous and it's immediate almost. And, fires, even in frequently burned systems, every 2-3 years, maybe. So, in terms of an adaptive force, it's that need for nutrients and moisture that's going to be first and foremost that tree's probably responding to.
Yep.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Considering all of what you've just talked about, Morgan, we talk on this podcast quite a bit, and I know just in the community in general, people that are interested in the use of fire, we talk about the timing of fire and how much that does or does not matter for different objectives. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, John, is because you just had a paper published on this topic talking about longleaf pine, I believe, and how seasonality affected those trees. So do you want to walk us through what you found in that study, and maybe that can launch us into some discussion on timing of fire relative to your pine production?
Sure. So this is a continuation of a long-term experiment started by Bill Boyer actually in the 70s. And what they did is they established they had 3 blocks where they had some naturally regenerated longleaf pine that they thinned down to about 500 trees per acre in the late 1970s. And the trees were 15 years old at this point. And what they did is they burned it in different seasons in under a biennial burning regime. So we had dormant season burning or winter burning, spring burning, summer burning, and then a no burn control. And so these stands were burned on a biennial basis following that seasonal pattern all the way through 2018. And so what we did is we picked up the measurements from 1995 when the trees were essentially 37 years old and carried it forward from that point. And really the take home points that we found were that there was no difference in terms of their productivity, their height growth, diameter growth, volume growth, or their survival among any of the burning treatments. And none of the burning treatments were significantly different from the unburned control as well. Now, that was similar to what Bill Boyer found in his first study, where seasonal burning didn't have an effect, but there was an effect of burning or not burning. Mm-hmm. What we found in this later version is that effect of burning or not burning had actually gone away. So there was no change in productivity or survival, whether you burned or not, or within any season or not.
Okay. So in terms of when the original study that was published found an effect of burning or not burning, was that a negative effect of burning?
Yes, there was a negative effect on productivity of burning. I think the title of the paper, if I'm not mistaken, is The Hidden Cost of Burning. That was published in the early 90s.
Oh, okay. So
late 80s.
Do you think, I'm sure there's probably many publications, and this is definitely both of your guys' expertise and realm of interest rather than mine, but do you think that paper has kind of pushed this perception, I guess, that you don't gain anything from burning, at least when you're managing a forest stand?
It's hard to say. I think that I think more than the paper itself, I think there's a long cultural tradition of not burning outside of the dormant season. And what that's been based in isn't necessarily hard science. I think there's a lot of things going on with that, but I wouldn't say that original paper really set the stage for the seasonal attitudes towards burning.
Yeah, I just meant burning in general. I mean, we do see in some sectors, I guess, with pine management that doesn't, in terms of pine production, doesn't seem to be worth it to burn to produce wood, that is.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's an attitude, in at least in those who are focused more on productivity, that there's nothing that can go well when you put fire in the stand. There's only things that can go wrong. And so even if 90% of the time there's no impact, it's that 10% of the time where you get that volume loss that resonates with people. And so
yeah,
I think,
like on the accident where you actually do get a crown fire that creates problems.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, fire's not it's not a perfect tool. We're not talking about a 100% efficacy. We can do things to limit damage with our best practices,
sure,
but it will never be 100%.
Sure. Well, that's interesting. Go ahead.
I was going to say I could share an anecdote. Bill, who was a phenomenal scientist and like incredible person. He was also, sort of, if you can imagine, white-headed, wearing his little sweater and, carrying his data in his hand. He gave a talk at the very first conference I attended. It was a Tall Timbers Fire Ecology Conference in Tallahassee. And it was an extension of those data that John's talking about. This is the late 90s. And talk about getting a room of managers and scientists whipped up when he presented this volume growth as this hidden loss concept. And the whole room was like, but what about, and but what about, but what about? And I think some of that is, was borne out by John's recent work to show that, that volume difference may have just been a short-lived response, but it also, and all of their questions at the time were things. I was an undergrad at the time, and I didn't understand the questions, but the questions were, how did you burn it? What was the fire behavior like? They were really delving into, because a lot of what happens, a lot of the arguments over seasonal burning or over fire's effects are when folks say it was burned or not burned or burned in a season. They don't give the details on how it's burned because, if I said something was burned in March, in Marcus, in your head, you're thinking, oh, that was that wet day in March that I remember. And I'm talking about a bone dry day. The grasses are all cured. The winds were whipping and the atmosphere was really receptive, and it was a barn burner. So getting at, the weather, getting at how they were burned, those sorts of things, always a lot of fire folks will go to and say, yeah, you need to tell more of the story. And I think a lot of the arguments about season really come down to that. It's really about how intense the fire was, what the fire behavior was like. A lot of those things will overwhelm what we all think about are seasonal differences, but really it's just what that day was like. There are hot, dry days or really dry days in February, and there are really dry days in August. Putting that stuff in perspective, I think, helps sometimes when you boil it down to season or not season.
Yeah, well, that's kind of one of the things that, aside from what I get questions about and I hear all the time in the community, that's one of the striking things about this study that John led was, I mean, based on what you hear, we should have expected there to be higher mortality, particularly, but even volume loss, I guess, on trees that didn't die from the summer burning, I would have thought, just based on what I was taught when I came through forestry school and what I hear about. Do you think that that's what the expectation, I guess, or the thought is in general? And why did we not see that if the ambient temperature was higher and it promoted, an easier damage, I guess, through convection, like you were talking about to the needles? Why did we not see that?
So good questions. A couple of things. I think you're right that the expectation going in based on prevailing thoughts that, again, we're not necessarily supported by data, but the attitudes going in probably would have expected damage to be greater in the summer, simply because the carbohydrates have already been allocated above ground, the potential for damage, the loss of the ability to grow during peak growing season could potentially lead to that reduced productivity and have some negative impacts on survival. So I would expect an early spring or summer burn based on that logic to have, all things considered equal, to have more damage than a wintering potential damage than a dormant season burn. That didn't happen. And I think a couple of reasons for it that I point to are, one, it's the biennial burning regime really did a lot to kind of counteract these potential seasonal effects. The fact that we never accumulated that fuel that Morgan was talking about, that's so important to causing damage and potential mortality through the radiating heat. We just never built that up. And we burned it with head fires, and with the lack of fuel accumulation, what likely happened out there was that the fire just moved on through, and you didn't have any of that smoldering effect that could have affected the roots. And we never really had an increase of hardwoods as a result either. So we didn't have that added fuel on the ground. Granted, hardwoods don't burn typically as hot as longleaf pine, but they still add fuel, which still contributes to the overall heat effect. And so I think really that biennial burning regime overrode the effects of seasonality. Had we gone 4 years between burns, I would suspect we would have seen some different results.
From a scientist standpoint, you're always jealous of other scientists when they can write a paper or do a study, and any outcome that John would get from that study would be a good story. Finding an effect that would show a seasonal difference, we could go, oh my gosh, watch out for the season X. Or in this case, not finding an effective season is actually a really good story.
Yeah.
Pardon
light it up.
My jealousy.
Light it up whenever you can get a permit.
Yep.
I tend to like that story personally.
Which is a great, you and I, Marcus, share that feeling. You've done quite a bit looking at availability of burn windows and how it overlaps with, all sorts of wildlife habitat and during different seasons for nesting, et cetera. And we've done a ton of work looking at the availability of burn windows across the Southeast. And what we consistently find is everybody knows that the winter and early spring that window is wide open. Everybody knows that it's hard to get a good burn day in the summer. The burn days basically go away. And what we found, and what we all kind of know, is that the lovely fall days that we all enjoy after the oppressive summer, there are a lot of really nice burn days there. And across the Southeast, that's handled in a really different way. And in North Mississippi and Oak Hickory upland hardwoods, they'll burn like crazy at that time of year. They burn right after litter fall. They'll burn before litter fall. And it's always interesting to me to see that in the southern pine woods that it's pretty rare to burn during that period.
Yeah, so basically in the fall, we get a lot of good burn days, but you don't see that reflected in people pulling permits and actually burning in the piney woods in particular. Yep. Well, that kind of brings me to another question, and I'll leave it open to whoever wants to address it however you wish. But one thing that I did not hear John say in his long-term study was a fall burning treatment. And I know you guys probably get it, and I know that I do get it plenty. Why wasn't that treatment present? And, I know that when I get questions about this, people are worried about burning their pine stands during the fall for fear of what you were trying to measure, John. They are fearful that they're going to kill their pines or decrease productivity substantially because of the time of year that they are burning it in. And I was just wondering, why was that not a treatment? And, is there data that can tell us about that, given what you just said, Morgan, that is a really good burn window that's not being used?
Well, I can't say for sure why Bill in the 70s did not include that as a treatment, as I was not alive.
Could you just go back and ask him, please?
I can knock on his old door and hear the whispers. But in terms of, I don't have any reason to say it would be more or less damaging for sure. I don't have any evidence, and there's scant evidence published detailing it. The only thing that pops into my head that could be a factor, and I'm just speculating with this, is you in the fall, you have the potential of still having rather warm temperatures. Increasing the possibility of crown scourge. And you could have some dieback of the herbaceous green vegetation, limiting some of that ability to cool the fire as it goes through. And so you could catch it at the wrong time potentially. And you could also catch it when you get a little bit more litter that falls. So you've got a little bit heavier litter load, less green herbaceous vegetation, and combine that with warm temperatures, you could be setting the stage for some damaging fire behavior. But you also don't have to burn on those days. You have the ability to say no.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like with anything else, the importance comes down to selecting the right burn conditions rather than just saying one season's out. I think it's really about looking at the conditions that exist on that day and making the decision based on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think we should dive into that a little more. If you really start thinking about it, okay, let's say it's been misting rain and, it's September 8th, and we decide we're going to burn on that day. Are we going to burn any pines down? Probably not, given if you have those kinds of conditions where fire will barely even light or may not even carry, you're not going to kill them. And if we flip that coin, you can kill longleaf burning it during March too, if you do it in a way that is conducive to killing those trees. So I think that's a really good point is, maybe the conditions or the parameters you're seeking out are a little different, and the types of the ways that you apply fire, the firing techniques or strategy might be a little different. I'll let you guys tell me more about that. But you have the ability to choose the conditions that you are attempting fire under, and that alone could mitigate a lot of the perceived risk, which, again, you said you don't even have any evidence from the literature. That's really curious to me, that there seems to be this strong negative perception of burning then, but what I'm hearing from you guys is there isn't, or there's not much data to suggest that that's a real fear.
Yeah, it's really spotty. There was some early work done on it, and we have a standard when we do our research, particularly with fire, that we kind of live by the full disclosure mantra. We got to say everything about how it was ignited. The level of detail for us to be able to publish our work about fire studies tends to be that the threshold is really, really high, because the nuance of these sorts of situations, something, a bone dry day, like you said, in March or in October, are still going to give you, the sort of negative consequences. And some of the early work didn't have those same standards, and they would report something. I mean, this is the same era where they would report that if, fire killed everything, don't use fire. And so vast areas of the country stopped using fire because of, research results that were inadequate, spotty, and you could even say cherry picked. The thing that I like about this topic is that, I got to come with my data. I'm not going to come and, speculate. I'm bringing an educated guess right now. We're trying to go after anecdote. I heard from this one person, or I heard there's this old study from 1953. It's a perfect ripe area for us to do research on it. Marcus, you and I are doing fall burning research right now to try to get at some of these. And that research takes a while to mature, for the results to mature. But it's a perfect kind of question, because with a window that wide open, and we're already fighting over burn days from everybody burning, or you can't burn on Mondays, you don't burn very much, Fridays don't burn very much, weekends don't burn, you start to limit your burning opportunities. It really puts to me a bigger question mark over that fall period. And I think this is a great spot for research to provide some good answers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's kind of interesting to me that would, given the enormous literature base on the use of fire, that there's very little on fall burning.
Yeah.
Particularly in pine woods where it's, they're extremely flammable, obviously. That's really curious and good points that you're making. Another thing that I feel it necessary to add is that these are also, we're picking on specific objectives.
Yep.
And if your objective is to produce loblolly pine wood, that's different than, me telling a landowner to use fall burning because they're interested in forbs for turkeys and deer or whatever. Their objectives are very different, and that might change your decision making to some degree. And there are a few papers, I guess, because recently there's been a couple more come out showing that there are some real desirable effects of fall burning in terms of the understory herbaceous community in particular. The structural things that you might actually gain from that time over other times for some habitat-oriented objectives for some species. So I think that's an important thing to also consider when we're nuancing and caveating and everything, that, when your objective is driven by pine saw timber, that's different than it being driven by how many turkey poults you have.
To me, I mean, that's a huge, I boil it down. Your non-listeners are going to get really mad at me when I say this, but I always look at folks as either forestry burners or wildlife burners. And you see their effects on the landscape, because a forester like me, I work on tree mortality, and I'll tell you, like, seeing a dead tree is, it's part of my business, but I'm like, oh my goodness, look at that poor tree's dead. And I'll fret and just, be so upset about it. Whereas the wildlife biologist working next to me will be like, we had too many trees anyway, Morgan. It's going to be okay.
Look at all of the dead wood obligates that are benefiting from that.
Yeah. And in general, most of our landscapes, I mean, we talk about longleaf pine savannas or southeastern pine savannas or woodlands. And what most of us are burning in are forests. They're closed canopy. They could use some light. Those understory forbs and grasses could use some light, use some resources. And so, I try to be a little more thoughtful about it, that, killing some trees is okay. And if we try to not kill any trees, then we're going to miss out on all these other objectives that are often more important to a landowner. But seeing a dead tree is something that you see for a long time. They stick out like a sore thumb. And so they tend to have a more lasting effect than seeing, more flowers in the understory, for instance.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another thing, I guess, to think about is how you kill the tree, right? So, generally I would be recommending to people that they kill trees by going in and harvesting some, making a little money off of it. But that may be less of a concern now that the pine markets are not doing very well, right? So it may be hard for a landowner even to get their pine stand. Mm-hmm. So, I'm not nearly as worried about that dead tree if doesn't have any value, I guess, is my point. Circling back a little bit, we were talking about the different considerations or how they might differ. If you were going to burn during March versus you're going to burn in September, what are the differences in maybe the conditions or the, what you're worried about? Are there any differences in the application of fire in a pine stand, given you have some interest in the trees?
Well, I mean, the best thing about burning in the winter and early spring in the South is that cold front passage is really predictable. All of us live that existence. Here comes that cold front. It's dumping precipitation, and what's behind it is a bunch of cold, dry air from Canada, from the Midwest that's coming down, and it's a perfect recipe for being able to burn. The fuels get wetted, and then they're starting to dry, and so every day after that, it's pretty predictable, and so you get into a bit of a rhythm. And the fall just doesn't have that same sort of, at least predictable as far as a precipitation band is coming. We tend to get, depending on where you are in the South, where John is, there's, a pretty substantial fall drought in Auburn. It's not the same drought in North Mississippi, and it's not the same drought in North Florida. And so those extended drought periods are one characteristic that's pretty spotty across the South, but most of us have, we experience that extended dry period. And all trees, when they're injured with fire, are going to suffer some post-fire water stress. And so, that could potentially be an issue. But again, if you're attuned and you're in the rhythm of burning, watching precipitation, or the probability of precipitation could could alleviate some of that that angst that somebody might have.
What about in terms of firing techniques?
Well, this is also one we could spend a whole hour on. I was just reading something this morning.
Let's just try to keep it to a minute and a half.
Folks have pretty strong feelings on all of it. Even in our building here at Tall Timbers, two scientists argue about it about weekly. And
the same two, or you're rotating which two?
No, it's the same two. It makes for uncomfortable lunches. There's a strong history in the South of using backing fires, particularly in pine plantations. And a lot of people just started that way. That's how they learn to burn, and that's how they burn. It's slow, in no hurry. You can all see all of us standing on a tool or with our hands crossed over a tool, and we're just watching this fire do what it's going to do. And there's pretty good evidence that can push heat into the soil. There's pretty good evidence it can, cause a little bit of bowl injury. And so the other end of that spectrum, the other person in the building will say, just use head fires. And there's sort of the old Stoddard mantra that life's too short for back, for back burning. And I think, that sort of, they're going to have different effects. And I think people have found individual burners with experience in a location and in those sorts of forest types, they'll come up with their own method. And you see people in central Alabama using flanking fire left and right. And you'll see, somebody on the adjacent land using something very different, and their forests or their woodlands look about identical. It's really, that's where it goes from sort of the science nerd into the artist on the landscape. And they're using fire in ways that I'm sitting there with my notepad trying to figure out, and it's just blowing my mind because the effects they have. They're burning with head fires moving down slope, et cetera, et cetera. There's just a lot of art in southern burning.
But from a logistical standpoint too, I look at it from the sense of how many acres of longleaf have we planted? What is the acreage out there that if we're really trying to maintain these open woodlands that we're going to have to burn every year? Now, certainly there are differences in firing techniques, but that life's too short to backfire. Well, if you've got 40 acres and it's yours, have at it. You can backfire it all day. But from a standpoint of how are we going to maintain this vast acreage that we're set up to restore, we're going to have to do things like incorporate more head fire, like burn in different seasons, expand the burn window if we're ever going to keep up with this. So that's just my, I guess, where the rubber meets the road forestry perspective.
That's a good point. I know that both of you have worked with this to some degree, and I'm familiar loosely with some of the research on it, but how many acres are we trying to burn, and how many of those are we getting burned, and what are ways that we can improve that disparity, if there is one?
Yeah, there's a huge disparity. I guess depending on where you are in the Southeast. Where Tall Timbers is, we're in the Red Hills region of South Georgia and North Florida. It's about a 250 to 300,000 acre area, depending on who's counting it. And there's about 100 to 125,000 acres of prescribed fire a year. That's a ton of fire. But it is a real outlier. If your listeners go and look at this thing called the Southeast Fire Map, and I think you'll have a link to it, you can really look at the Southeast, and there's some, pardon the pun, there's some hot spots in the Southeast where there's a lot of fire. It tends to be located on national forest lands. And then there are a few outlier privately held landscapes, a lot of quail lands, central Alabama, North Florida, et cetera. But it really is just a few places where a lot of burning is taking place. And, there's a long list of ways that we can improve that. One of them is looking at the burn windows more carefully and starting to see, how we take advantage of the good days that we have. The blanket prescriptions for the Southeast, it can't be increase the burn unit sizes. A lot of the national forests have done that, and they see issues with quail populations following that. It can't be burning them all 10 acres at a time. Really, it's one of those things that in that toolbox analogy, it's every single tool because we live in a very productive landscape. And if we don't burn it, it'll come back really, really quickly. And if we do burn it, we got to stay on top of it. And so really it's using all of the above. Folks mixing mechanical treatments in, folks mixing herbicides in, et cetera. It's really on all of the above kind of strategy, because very few places are burned enough. And the habitat shows it, wildlife populations show it, rare species show it, et cetera.
To add to that, I'm always thinking about barriers. What are barriers to using fire? Because a lot of the wildlife species that I really care about, and a lot of the listeners seem to care about, need fire. So I'm trying to think of ways to relieve people of those barriers. Sounds like there's been a barrier, at least a perceived barrier, from burning pines in fall. We don't have very good evidence to suggest that should be a barrier or not. But we do have some evidence that it could provide some real benefits in some scenarios for wildlife. So one real big benefit is that it opens up the burn window, like you were talking about. But I often, thinking about it from a private landowner to a public, entity, there's some differences. I commonly will suggest to people that they scale down their burning, not necessarily because it has a better ecological consequence. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, depending on the context. And we could belabor that point, but we won't. But what I'm seeing that scale as being a barrier, again, for someone that's less experienced or that has more skin in the game, so to speak, if it's their own land, or more to worry about. Scaling down might actually get more fire on the ground in that context, because people are more willing to use fire when it's at a smaller scale. And I would rather them be using fire, even though it's at a smaller scale, than, that. I guess my point of that comment right there was the barriers to getting more acreage burned might be quite different depending on whether you're in the private sector or the public sector. And that's often a source of tension, I think, for people across those sectors, and something that we should all be thinking about, is we do have different objectives and limitations and barriers, but we all have the similar mission that we think more fire needs to be on the ground for a lot of ecological reasons. But how we accomplish that might be quite different. So,
and Marcus, I'd be remiss as a silviculturist not to say that, I think fire is an excellent maintenance tool. It maintains ecosystems. But for lots of your listeners, they're probably starting from a different point where it's going to be very difficult to burn those stands, where they may need to use different tools like herbicides or mechanical thinning to open those up initially, and to not be afraid to do that, because you can run fire in there and you're not going to win the battle. That battle's it's too far gone. So it's going to be a combination of tools in those situations, which unfortunately is a lot of the landscape.
Yeah, and a lot of them, if they haven't experienced it themselves, have probably seen areas where we've had to go in and do some other preparatory treatment to get it ready to burn. That kind of leads me into the last question that I wanted to ask you guys is, for people who have pines, they would like to start burning, but maybe they planted them 20 years ago and they never have done it, but they're interested in doing that now. How do they go about that? Because it sounded like, Morgan, you were saying that the risk to pines from burning could be higher in that scenario. So what should they do? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think your point, it goes back to that last point, your tirade is what I was going to call it.
Diatribe is another good word.
Yeah, definitely. We have a private lands, for lack of a better descriptor, a burn team that goes and works with landowners. And I've heard comments where folks will say, they didn't burn very much. That was a lot of effort. And you burn 6 acres or you burn 12 acres to that landowner. And, to your previous point and this question, that's often what you need is there's some hand holding, there's some education, there's some mentoring, folks learning as apprentices. Fire as a community is a very experiential field. You can learn stuff in a classroom, but really it's, being out there and seeing how stuff happens. You can tell people an equation for fire spread, but until you see it, it doesn't become real. And I think for those sorts of situations, it's almost like you've taken your first class in medical school and now you're doing open heart surgery. A lot of situations can be really, really difficult. And there's there are pretty great resources through the NRCS, gets folks in contact with folks. Lots of consultants have been doing this for decades, or they have crews that the cumulative experience is, more than a century out in the woods with you. The Cooperative Extension Service through every one of the southern states has those, has great contacts and great experience. But I think, looking at fire, and to John's point, looking at other potential treatments to get you on the way there. I love it when people are thinking about fire, but I have the same, often have the same, cautions. Let's take this slow. Let's not bite off more than we can chew. You got a 400-acre burn unit and it hadn't burned in 20 years is nobody's first burn. It ought to be, I burned an acre. I think I'm figuring this out. Maybe you burn 2 acres next time, and you're very slowly figuring out where that sweet spot is. And you're learning from experts who in the fire field are also really amazingly generous with their time and their advice. None of them are short on advice.
I've certainly learned that over the years. Yeah. Well, there's good points.
And there's some things you can do. I mean, if it's in that degraded condition, to the most extreme, you could get out and rake around those trees, get rid of that accumulation around the base. We're talking small acreage if you're going to be doing that. But, if that's the condition you have, you may want to back off considering burning in these other seasons, burning in the summer, burning in the fall. Maybe that's not the best time to try this. Again, I go back to my study. What I attribute a lot of the results to was just the lack of fuel accumulation. Well, with 20 years of fuel accumulation, I'm going to be very conservative with that. So I'm looking for like Morgan described, that cold front passing, and I know I have consistent weather, and I can go at it slowly over time and just kind of eat away at the acreage and slowly get it burned back into a condition. But it's certainly not a situation where you want to approach it fast.
Yeah, you definitely, that's great points that you don't necessarily, and probably under most circumstances, don't want to do the same thing everywhere. And when you have stands that you're trying to get into the rotation, you could do what you just said and cherry pick the safest and best of conditions possible to introduce fire in that one. And the one that you've been burning every year for the last 50 years could be the one that you try the new time of year on or something like that. It's probably a little bit facetious, but you get what I'm going with. There certainly are some instances where people have been burning frequently for a long time, so that could be the case. So I guess that was pretty well answering most of my questions. Are there any other thoughts that you think people need to think about when they're thinking about burning at different times or burning during the fall for pines or just in general? We'll try to keep it to fire ecology. I saw the look on your face, Morgan. And
it's only 4 weeks of football season.
I felt like I needed to go ahead and curb that conversation, put some bounds on it. Yeah. Well, that's a good point. That's one reason I don't think a lot of people burn in the fall in the South is because college football happens on Saturdays.
Yeah, and you got to put a board on Friday, and you got a hangover on Sunday. So yeah, you're right.
Yeah, the only thing we're burning is hot dogs or something, right?
Well, I think for me there's a lot of talk about increasing fire, or in a lot of areas it's maintaining fire. And if it was easy to do it, we'd have already figured it out. And so a lot of these places, a lot of the landscapes that we're all managing or care about, we know that land management is not trivial. There are a lot of things that go into it, whether you're fighting invasives, you've got feral hogs, you've got, insert the issue of the day. And fire is clearly an important goal, or at least the effects that fire generates tends to be really central to a lot of what the reason we own land and the reason that we manage land. And I think seeing it as a long-term commitment and being part of a land management program, that to me is that acknowledgement that it's that important is the direction folks can go. And like I said earlier, there's a tremendous amount of help out there, through whether it's an NGO or state or federal agency. They're all there to try to facilitate what is clearly a conservation need. And the South has been a national model for it, and likely will continue to be a national model. And so the future looks pretty bright for those types of efforts in Southern Pine and in hardwood stands.
I guess I just close with reminding your listeners that, what Morgan and I are talking about today, and you too, and you as well, Marcus, a lot of this, we're waiting on the research to come in. So let's be patient. These are our best thoughts of what might happen out there. But there's a lot of different scenarios, like Morgan started out talking about. Every stand is different. I mean, predominantly, implicitly, we've been talking about mature trees during this whole conversation. This whole thing might change if we're talking about sapling size trees. And so, yet be very cautious with what we're saying until the data comes in. And when we have strong data, I think you'd hear all of us come out and state that and stand behind it. But right now, we're still at a stage where we think this might happen, but we don't have conclusive evidence.
Particularly with fall burning, as it relates to pines.
Yep.
But even then, we have to really narrow down what you're caveating, So, good thoughts, guys. I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about that. I certainly fielded plenty of questions related to this topic, and it's nice to have some folks like you to come on here that actually have answers to tell us about some of these questions. So I appreciate y'all doing that. And before we sign off for the day, I always like to give you the opportunity to tell listeners where they can find you if they're looking for you.
Yep, Morgan Varner I'm at Tall Timbers Research Station.
John Willis, just my name, at USDA.gov, I'm based out of Auburn, Alabama.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. For everybody listening out there, as always, we'll provide links and things in the notes so that you can look at the relevant research or find these guys. So thanks for listening. Another great show. Appreciate it, guys. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.